This week we're going to be discussing a film directed by Chang-dong titled Burning. It came out in 2018. I think it's part of like this new wave of Korean cinema that everybody's kind of excited about. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have seen Parasite. So there might be little comparisons later with that film. This film, just to get some context, it's not your traditional, I would say, like film experience. Also, it has a cast of like a couple Korean, I think Stephen Wan is Korean, but like he has this background of both American and Korean background. But it's one of those films where I think, unfortunately, it didn't get a lot of reception in 2018, and so I, brought it to the surface with this podcast. I'm hoping to get more viewers and more discussion around this film. And I'm gonna let you take it over about maybe a bit of a high level like story arc, because I think this film we can go really deep here. So I want to make sure that maybe we talk about some of the basic points of the normal, like the story arc, like how it's like maybe there's a part A of like a love triangle and part B is like a mystery, even though I'm gonna be honest with you, that's oversimplifying it. But I'm curious about what you thought, like, because I know this film wasn't on your radar. It was on like probably it's potentially could be lost to history because it's not discussed often.
Yeah, so I'll just first start off by saying this is, I believe, my third Korean film that I've seen. Parasite being the first one, and there was another Bong Joon-ho film that I saw. It's escaping my mind. It was a 2014 film, Snowpiercer. And so this is the third film that I've seen. And what was pretty interesting before we get into the storyline, just seeing sort of the cast lineup, I was very surprised to see Stephen Yeun in this film. I had only previously seen him in The Walking Dead. It was a show that I used to watch years ago. And in that show, he plays someone who's, I would say, plays a delivery boy, if I'm not mistaken, in this post-apocalyptic world. And he's just not, within that TV show, his character develops over time, but at first he's just not a very confident sort of character, right? He's thrown into this world that's post-apocalyptic. So it's really interesting seeing him play that character and that character role, and then going into this role where he plays a much more serious, much more calm and borderline sinister character. And it was just really interesting seeing him with this sort of change of pace. I thought his performance was just outstanding. And I would include that with the roles of the other two main characters as well. I thought the cast was just phenomenal. This was a super well acted and directed film. Arguably might have been the best directed film we've watched so far, but we'll get into that discussion later. This is just my opinion. But yeah, sort of the main storyline of this film is you're introduced to Lee Jong-seo, and he's most of the cast is in they're sort of millennials in Korea, and so Lee Jong-soo is someone who's graduated college, but he works sort of odd jobs. It doesn't seem like he has everything fully figured out. The whole time he's telling everyone that he's a writer, right? But he never really discussed when asked about what he's writing. He never really gives an answer. He says he's still trying to figure out what exactly he wants to write, but that's what his sort of goals and ambitions are, is to like write a novel. And so when asked about sort of what his influences are, he talks about Faulkner. At another point in time, he talks about he likens another character, Ben, who Stephen Yeun plays, as Great Gatsby. So it was pretty interesting. But sort of backtracking is that, yeah, you have Lee Jong-soo, and randomly he meets this character named Jaime, and she's working at, I don't even know what exactly her job is. She's working as like a promoter, if you will, in front of a departmental store. And so they meet, and Jaime says, "Don't you remember me?" to Jong-soo, and he doesn't really recognize her because she had plastic surgery, but it turns out, just surface level, they were childhood friends. And Jong-soo, so they sort of reconnect, and Jong-soo is attracted to her. And what ends up happening is Jaime ends up going to Africa for a little bit. And while she's in Africa, she asks Jong-soo if he will feed her cat while she's away. Now, what's pretty interesting is that he never actually sees the cat, but he does see that there is there's definitely a cat there, or it appears like it, because in the litter box there is always poop there. So meaning that there has to be some cat that's in the apartment, even though he never sees this cat. And when Jaime returns from Africa, you're introduced to this third character. His name is Ben, played by Stephen Yuan. And from there, you don't really understand what Ben's intentions are. Jong-seo, for most of the film, is trying to figure out what sort of intentions this guy has when he asks what his sort of profession is or how he makes money, because it's very clear from the very beginning when you meet Ben that he's very affluent. He comes from sort of the upper tier of society economically. But there's always a lot of ambiguity throughout this film, especially when it comes to sort of Ben's personal life or his background. And so it gives you this sense of almost anxiety as a viewer, which was really interesting, because a lot of sort of the events and storyline are kind of cryptic. You kind of have to read in between some of the symbolism and messaging. And so what ends up happening is there's this sort of love triangle, if you want to describe it in that way, between Jaime, Ben, and Jong-seo. And at a certain point, Jong-seo basically levels with Ben, telling him that he's in love with Jaime. But then immediately after that, he berates Jaime for essentially dancing topless, and he's visibly hurt by some of her actions. And that's the last time you really see Jaime and Jong-seo together. And for the rest of the film, you don't really know what happens to Jaime. And Jong-seo is trying to piece this together, and he thinks Ben has something to do with it. And that's essentially the sort of plot gist. There's a lot more to it, and I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of what goes on in the film. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I was gonna say you did a really good job with like the the storyline, but like I think what I'll tell our audience is one of the difficulties with this movie is that the mechanics of like the story, the plot itself, is like just, it almost sometimes feels inconsequential to what this movie is trying to tell you.
Yeah,
in the sense that like if we just said the plot, like most movies, if we just said the plot, that's like that's like 50% of our podcast.
That's very surface level.
Yeah, this is right. Like just saying the plot just helps us with our like going through this conversation. Mm-hmm. But like this is kind of movie where like it's maybe 10% of like the whole, like there's a lot of like meat to this one. And so yeah, I think at a high level you did perfectly, where like it's kind of like part A is like this Jong-seo feels very like kind of like he's kind of demonizing Ben in his mind of like, oh, he's stealing the girl I want. And then part two is like, what happened to her? She doesn't respond to my calls. She's disappeared. And it's like a mystery. In that sense, I mean, Parasite's part A, part B. But just saying that, it's a film where I'm still like obsessed about it to a degree. And I do feel like it doesn't even give it justice, like those plot points, like those are important, but like there's just so much more we're potentially going to dig into. That's the one thing I'll add. So going back to the beginning, right? Like, first of all, like the character saying like they got plastic surgery, like doesn't happen often with movies I watch, which I found like, that's when I knew it was definitely a different kind of movie.
So hold on, before you begin, I just want to mention to the audience, neither of us are Korean. So a lot of what we're talking about is sort of our perception of this Korean film through the lens as Americans, right? There's a lot of cultural context and some things we probably miss because we haven't been immersed in Korean society that we might not get right necessarily, but having read a little bit more, we sort of have somewhat of an understanding. So there's some clear things throughout the film that were meant specifically for Korean audiences that Americans might not necessarily pick up. I just wanted to pretext that, so you can go ahead.
Yeah. And then I was going to say, I just said the plastic surgery, which is well known if you've read any high level, Korean news or documentaries. But I think one of the themes of this film and also with Parasite, which is why I think there is a little comparison, even though I don't think they're different movies. And I think they're also trying to even like through artistic form tackle it differently. Is that you do see what, like you said, with all three characters, right? There is this gender class dynamic, right? Like if we just do the simple, let's do the first simple example with Ben versus Jong-seo, right? Like Jong-seo looks like he came from a more, let's say, rural maybe a fractured home, or like the sense you get from Ben is that he doesn't really talk about his family or his parents, but he seems to have a lot of abundance, right? Like he lives in a nice apartment, he drives a Porsche. He's not really concerned about like the normal needs and wants of everyday citizens who are more financially insecure. And I think the character is a perfect like almost representation of I think this affluent. I think in any society, right? This affluent kind of like individual who has a lot of money, has a lot of privilege, and now it's just living day to day, enjoying the luxuries of life. You know, while like Jong-seo and Jaime are kind of like, and they're still different, but they're at the lower level of the class structure, and they have to deal more with like those uncertainties, of pain, loss, of identity, of what am I supposed to do? How do I live a good life? Like the old Aristotelian question. And I'm going to focus on the beginning of the movie because I think because we've discussed this a bit before this podcast. I started thinking about the parts of the movie we didn't really discuss, and I one of the first scenes that I thought was really important in the movie was when you covered actually a little bit, like they reunite and then they actually have dinner together, right? They're eating at the restaurant, and that's where you get the introduction to little hunger, greater hunger. But also I forgot about like when she peels the orange. I don't know if you remember, like the fake like imaginary orange and like
I forgot what you called that. They actually mentioned what sort of the idea of imagining something's there and sort of acting, but I can't remember the exact art form that's called. It's escaping. Go anyway.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's like it reminds me of the mime stuff, but but that's where you get the first like one of the themes, right? Little hunger, greater hunger, and little hunger is like your kind of like superficial needs. If you're familiar with the hierarchy of needs, right? I forgot who
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, but like the higher is like more abstract, and the lower is like what you need to just live day to day.
Yeah.
And then tying in again with what you mentioned with the African trip, she says like she's going to Africa to quote unquote satisfy her a greater hunger, which I thought about a little bit more, and I actually do side with your opinion about like a lot of the stuff that she does and says is very superficial, and there's a bit of shallowness. But
you have to sort of explain the reason why this gets brought up, or how it's sort of brought to the audience's attention, is she is planning on going to Africa, and she's telling Jong-seo that. And her idea is she wants to be out in like the Sahara Desert, or I forgot it was the Sahara Desert or one of the other deserts in Africa. She wants to be with the Bushmen, right? And within the society of Bushmen, one of the sort of practices they hold is this idea of, like you were saying, little hunger and that of greater hunger. And so that's first introduced in that way. And so really, I think what the director was trying to get at is, with that in mind, those two concepts of little hunger or greater hunger, you could sort of view how the characters act as to like whether they or not they sort of perceive life through little hunger or greater hunger. That was one of like the big sort of themes in the film. Just trying to parse through that.
Yeah, I think with her character specifically, I also see a lot of thematic themes of womanhood, and also how society views women, like as potentially objects, but also like how, and I think this is like a lot of societies, right? Like we view women as like virtuous because they're mothers and they're caretakers and they're motherly, and then at the same time we objectify them like objects, as commodities. The fetishization of womanhood is actually something that it's a very probably capitalistic thing, and we can get into that later because there's a lot of other scenes that touch on this. But yeah, she leaves, and then she comes back with Ben, and I thought it was sort of funny was when they said like we were the only Koreans there. I was like, well, no, duh. Like I don't think many Koreans.
Yeah, well, not a lot of people go to Kenya. Period.
Yeah,
and much less Koreans.
And you actually see in that airport scene that Jong-seo is already taken aback, right? Because he already in his mind is playing like, oh, this is my girl,
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm probably gonna marry her. We just got to get to there. And I jumped around because before that there is the sex scene, which I do want to touch upon. But like you were saying, like his body language. So speaking credit to acting, his body language actually told me more sometimes than what he said. Like it was that good. Like that's a really good, that's when the performance is good. Where like, because I've seen guys that have that like, oh, the face, or they make the the little twerk in the face, and like, oh, I don't want to say anything, but this is uncomfortable because like I wanted to,
Right, it was a little awkward in that sort of sequence.
But sorry, going back before when she leaves, she's left to Africa, and he has to take care of the cat. Before that actually happens, they have coitus. I want to say coitus. And that scene, I'm interested in your take on that, because like I thought it was one of those scenes where it felt like awkward, but like sort of realistic. And
so I think that what was more interesting about that it was more, at least what I found interesting, was more of the director's choice of angles. Like he wanted to get sort of Jong-seo's perspective throughout that sort of sequence. What was really interesting is you see him look into the closet at one point. And you can't quite tell. The other thing is I couldn't quite tell if he was trying to look for the cat, or if it was the cat's shadows, or if it was just some light. And in reality, what I think it was is that there were a few scenes there where you're looking through Jaime's window and looking out on this tower, and this tower sort of represents hope, right? At least that's sort of my interpretation. And you see the light sort of come through the window, because her apartment's pretty dark for the most part, and she even says the light doesn't really come in but like at a specific time of day. And so it's interesting because you see the light go through the closet, and so he's looking at the light, and then you're sort of seeing it disappear. And I was trying to figure out essentially what the meaning might be, but it might be of sort of how Jaime is introduced into his life, but soon she will be sort of gone from it. I'm not sure if that's the correct interpretation, but that's sort of where I was sort of going with that, or why that might be happening. I don't know if that was necessarily the director's, what the director wanted the audience to get out from that. I'm curious as to what your interpretation of the light in him looking at the light in the closet is represented.
I don't have a better interpretation. For me personally, what I took away from that scene was I felt like Jaime was actually doing what I think a lot of women do in today's culture, which is because these are both individuals there's part of them that's sort of broken for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And I think they're both using each other as a way to fill that void.
Sure.
And I think it's sort of unfortunate, I think, to a sense that like in today's society, I think, she wants to, basically keep him around, like not keep him around, but, basically like form some kind of like connection in the sense, like not just physical, but also like just to like
have someone there.
Yeah, like just let's have at least emotional, like mental connection or something like that. And she kind of like, because when I got out of that scene was that like they're doing the typical like satisfy their needs of like have sex.
Yeah.
But that scene, like you said, the angles were interesting, but also I never got the sense that they were like I felt like they were both kind of awkward in it, and also they were just maybe playing the role that they thought they needed to play. I thought
they're very awkward, but more what I was intrigued by in terms of directorial choice was that at a certain point it shifts from both of them on screen to just having Jong-seo. That's what was very interesting to me.
Yeah, what I've got out of that, because I've thought about it a little bit too, is that I think we're mainly seeing the movie only through his perspective,
yeah,
and that's why I think that's why we're getting a certain like, and I think that's a cinematic technique to maybe like subliminally tell us that like we're only seeing that he's like how he's interpreting the
world, really, yeah.
Also, when that scene starts, it's also the first time you see that her room is really messy, which becomes important later.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he goes to visit many times to feed the cat. But that scene, like that initial shot where like you see the desk, you see the like you said, her bed, the closet, the window, that scene definitely sets it in that like, she's, not rich because look how she lives, and that she has not a lot of space, but also that her life is full of clutter. And I think there's also symbolism of like, she's also very confused.
Yeah,
because I got that through many scenes that she is just a confused individual in this modern world. But yeah, and also when he grabs the condoms, I was just like, oh, that's just like so like that greedy realism, like
yeah. That whole sequence was just very awkward, I will say.
And like with the whole like light and stuff, I don't have a better interpretation. I do think like it might be also the other way to look at it, if you think about it, is like maybe instead of like hope, but think of it the other way around. Like somebody's like peering in, that like there is no true there, that they are being watched by maybe culture, society, you know, like what is acceptable, what's not acceptable.
Yeah, it
You
could
know,
be.
that is also because I think in countries like, I think different like let's say non-Western countries, I think there also is a different interpretation of what is public and
Of like,
private.
yeah.
And I think that could be another interpretation, but I really don't have a better one than the one you propose.
So
But
what do you think? What do you
go
think
ahead.
the cat represents? Because you never really see the cat in that sequence.
Yeah, and it's implied later that you do, but you don't know, right?
Well, do you?
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
I I don't really know what the cat represented like as a symbol. There's a lot of like the ideas that come to my mind. I would say that I'm more interested about your interpretation on that because you're
Sure.
proposing the question. You know, I haven't put too much thought into like what the cat actually means, but if I had to take like, let's say, a high level like on off the cuff answer, I think the cat represents kind of like doubt. Like, do you really know something? Do you really know a person when like this part of them is like maybe concealed from you? Because like you're right, in terms of the film style, one could argue we never see this cat, and also there's implied later there was never a cat. So remember the landlord says like there's no cat here,
Hmm.
and she says, look, see, there's no cat here. But he feeds the cat. There's poop, and then later, like I said, later in the movie, it's implied that this cat that he later holds is her cat. But that's all. This movie, like again, I'm getting a little more into the high level themes. But this movie also, the reason I think I liked it so much is that like we live in an era now of like misinformation, right? Like there's a lot of, you can see information presented in one way, but it could have another meaning if it's presented in another. And we have a harder time now deciphering what's real, what's not, because of the what I call the virtualization of our culture, which is something that the French philosophers in the 80s and 70s covered very well, with the juxtaposition of like, if you view it from one angle, you know, it can represent A, but if you view it from another, it can represent B. And there's actually all the way goes back to Plato's allegory of the cave. But yeah, I think I'm interested about what your interpretation of the cat is. I think the cat is like almost a symbolic nature of like
Of
the
doubt. Yeah.
unknown and doubt. You know?
I think it could be one other possible interpretation, because like your idea sort of seems pretty valid. But if you look, and I'll sort of circle back because this sort of goes throughout the film, the ideas of little hunger and big hunger. If you look at the three main characters, I view Jong-seo as sort of his person as being big hunger. That he's always sort of searching for, you know, the whole thing is like he's trying to figure out what he wants to write about, searching for like sort of his purpose in life. Some of that, I think that the cat might be representative of like truth in a way that he's trying to figure out what's sort of going on from his, because he personally never sees the cat, right? And I think it's him trying to piece everything together, trying to find it. But at that point in the film, he can't quite figure everything out at that point. And so it's the idea that sort of the truth is there, it's just he can't quite see it yet. And that's clearly evidenced by the fact that there was feces in the litter box. So he knows there's evidence that there is a truth. It's just that at that point in time, he just can't see it yet. If that sort of makes sense.
I mean that your explanation reminds me a lot what I think the leap of faith that many people who are religious have, right? Like they see like, oh, there's the
Yeah.
natural world, there is the beauty of nature, there is the universe. This can't just be coincidental, but you don't ever really like talk to God, right? You don't see him face to face.
Yeah,
It's similar in that dynamic where like
sure, but I
it's like
wouldn't.
a partial unknown, but like you think there's something there. You know?
But so I wouldn't just go with the religious thing because I think it's more than that. I think it's him trying to, or the religious angle. I think it's him trying to figure out because him of himself, he doesn't quite like many times throughout the film. Like his whole thing is it's about him being a writer, right? He doesn't sort of the big purpose for him is he wants to write a story, right? That's sort of what he wants, and he doesn't know what he wants to write yet. So he seems kind of like he hasn't found fully his purpose or his sort of truth in a way. And I think he thinks that Jaime is falling into that, at least at that point in the film. But he hasn't quite sort of figured everything out. And I think that's sort of what the cat represents. It's like him trying to figure everything out.
Yeah, I was using the religious example as a human, like a human behavior, because I think
Yeah.
I something to that, because I tend to believe that like we tend to believe our half truths because of our experiences, what we've seen, what we've felt, and I think that is why we're always kind of like moving along, looking for the truth, but like I think it's always elusive because like again you're trapped by like your interpretation of what you think it could be or what it is. But yeah, moving forward a little bit, because I know that we want to get to, I think, to the Ben stuff, but so there's that again, they eat, they have intercourse. Also, when he's feeding the cat, I think it was also intriguing is that Jong-seo has these scenes where he is, which I personally find a little bit creepy, but I think there was a purpose for it, where he is like kind of still lustful because he misses her. Basically, that's his way of actually. If you think about it, both characters, Jaime and Jong-seo, are kind of emotionally stunted.
Yes.
And I think instead of like articulating it through words or through his writing, he is actually just masturbating through some scene.
So I think that's sort of something that's interesting, and we should sort of touch upon is that going off of what I know sort of about Japanese culture is that it seems as though showing emotions is like not really socially acceptable, if you will. And the reason I say that is because I think I've talked to you about this before. Within Japanese culture, and I think Japan and Korea have like a lot of similarities in this sort of way, even though there are clearly differences, is that within Japan, like apparently there's this sort of trend of having, where it's now a thing in Tokyo, where individuals can hire sort of they can have the boyfriend experience. And what this service will provide is this Japanese young man will come in, and he'll play like a really sad emotional movie, and he'll be there and sort of cuddle with you while you cry. And that was something that was really like, whoa, very different from sort of our culture, where I guess crying is not really that taboo or frowned upon. But I think what I'm trying to get at there is that I think that's speaking to a bigger theme within Korean society, in that I think a lot of people have very hard times expressing emotion because society doesn't necessarily, within Korea, allow youth to sort of display emotion in that way.
Yeah, so going back to that scene where there's a couple scenes I believe where he's actually
pleasuring himself.
And I think part A is the emotional stuntness, but I think part B of my explanation of why these scenes are there and what they're there to convey is also, because I think it ties in later, is the objectification of women. And because if you in my interpretation, he's doing this because he views her very like physically still,
Yeah,
like
he does.
He just reunited her and then she just left. He hasn't really made a true emotional bond. So it's all physical in his head of what they could be. He's projecting a lot, which I think if you're a male viewer, listen to this podcast, you probably can identify to that to a degree. And also, I think it also is a little like, I think it's a little nod and hint, not hint, but a little nod also to like, because of this objectification, so also it's part of that conversation on like, the misogynistic nature of, especially like maybe Korea or cultures in general.
His character's a little more deep than that. I think part of his emotional stuntedness, if you will, stems from what his family life is, because he grew up poor. His mom, as you find out later in the film, left him. So I think he has a lot of parental issues or abandonment issues from that.
And they hint strongly that his father has mental illness.
Yes, yeah. And he's just stubborn. And there's some weird, specific weird scene when he's in a courtroom at one point, and you just see the father look over to his son as like the arraignment is being had, and Jong-seo can't look at his father in the eyes, and there's something sort of strange there. So he doesn't have the most stable family life, and that just seeps into his sort of romantic engagements as well, where clearly he's just not all. He's not fully mature in terms of like his emotional relationships that he has with Jaime specifically.
Yeah. And I think those are kind of like the beginning scenes, unless you have other ones you want to cover that I wanted to highlight, because I think those really set up like
The tone.
when Ben comes into, I guess the town. He does go to.
No, I said the tone.
But also it works out that I made a mistake in hearing that word, because I forgot the other important scene is actually when you see the farm, right? Because after Jaime leaves, he does visit the farm. He does. You see the, the state of it actually reminds you of Jaime's room, because it's disorganized, messy. And I think the messiness represents like the class difference, because when we see Ben's apartment, it's pristine,
it's spotless.
But there's also, we see a little cameo of the president of the United States. I think it's something you might want to touch upon. I know you picked up on it a lot more than I did. So.
Well, it was interesting because I'm not super familiar with the economic affairs of Korea, and from American perspective, at least I don't know. At least from my perspective, it is like being an American, is that we sort of view Korea as being pretty technologically advanced. They have quite a few tech companies up there, specifically Samsung. And so you sort of view them as being more Western and pretty economically developed. But when you sort of see Jong-seo listening to some news clip that includes President Trump from us, as well as sort of the state of economically of Korea, it was really interesting, because in this little clip, and this is back in 2018, they were, in the news clip, they were talking about how the OECD, or I guess in the latest OECD report at that point, was pointing to how Korea had one of the of all OECD countries, they had one of the fastest rates of unemployment for the youth, I think from 18 to 30-year-olds, which is really surprising. And I think that sort of was something they really wanted to include and get across for people who may not be familiar that much with Korean society, that they have a lot of issues with young people gaining employment, and that economic frustration is just seeping to all aspects of their society within the youth of Korea.
Yeah, and I don't want to derail, because I don't want to derail too much, but I do think that scene's in there because I think this movie also is trying to touch upon that, Korea modernized like many Asian countries did in the 20th century. And I think there's been a lot of invisible carnage that we don't quantify through the analytics of like GDP or wage growth or anything, but I think this movie is touching upon, I think, themes that I think are a bit universal, because I think people everywhere, especially young people, are touching upon this, where I think this, for all this like global trade, internet, and I guess the power of like modern technology and trade and economics, there is a lot of anxiety, depression, aimless youth. I think that's definitely a factor. I think young people, especially in the developed world, and that includes actually now Asia, I think there is a question of like, what am I doing? Like, why am I just working so hard? Why am I trying so hard to get a job that I'm not going to enjoy, just to save money so I can retire, if I'm lucky enough not to die of any other disease at 65, just to just perish, And I think the world, in a sense, is having this kind of like
existential moment.
Yeah, like double take of like, what are we doing this for? Like, But I think that's when we get later, after we talk about the other mechanics of the film. But yeah, that scene is in the beginning of the movie, and like you said, I think it's also important for setup for later when because I think now I'm looking back at it, I think when Ben arrives, a lot has happened. Like, he doesn't just arrive like 10 minutes in. He arrives after a lot of scenes have occurred.
It's about 20 to 30 minutes in.
But when he comes in, then the movie starts moving along. I think you're supposed to pick up on all the little nuances beforehand to get you to appreciate, I think, the second part of the film, or not second part, I guess the later, like the second half, as I would say, because that's when the airport scene happens, and now we can continue from there. So I'll let you take it on from the airport scene, because I already mentioned that it was awkward, and Jong-soo was like, I get it, right? You're into this chick, and you're like, why are you coming back with another dude? Like,
so I mean, he clearly thought that he had an emotional connection, and then you're introduced to Ben, and Ben is this character who, it's really mysterious. Clearly, he comes from a lot of money. He has a Porsche that you later see. And this clearly contrasts, like, he's pretty opposite to Jong-soo. Right, and so there's this interesting dynamic that is between Jong-soo, Jaime, and Ben. And the one thing that's interesting is after their awkward encounter, they go to the restaurant, right? And they're all eating, the three of them. And you hear that. I think this is one of the most important scenes of the film based on the interactions and what they're talking about. The one scene I found fascinating and talking about emotion was you hear Jaime talk about her experience in the I think it was the Kalahari Desert. It was not the Sahara, but she's there at the Kalahari Desert, and she's talking about her experience with the Bushmen and how peaceful it was. But she's also talking about how she was the only one there, or the only one without someone else there on as part of her trip. And she's like, I don't think I've ever felt so alone. She's like, and the thought of sort of dying just terrified me. But at the same time, I wish I had disappeared as if I never existed. This sort of existential like moment was just, I think it was like super powerful within the scene because it gives a lot of information about where Jaime's coming from. And I think sort of a representation of a lot of people within Korea. But then, so you see her cry at that moment. And then on the flip side, you see, and this is all Jong-seo seeing this perspective of Jaime and Ben. Right after she's done crying, Ben's like, fascinating. He's like, I always found the idea of like humans crying fascinating because I've never like cried in my life. It was just like, it was almost like the two characters were just completely from different worlds, like two extremes. I wanted to get your sort of take on that.
Yeah, I mean that's one, I think that's one of the more profound scenes I think in the film, especially in the early scenes. Like that line by Ben is important, but I think when, like you were saying, going to Jaime, like having that breakdown, you start seeing that like it's another hint of her like vulnerability, but also like how much she's confused, right? Like, oh yeah, basically sounds like somebody who is very depressed and actually, horribly depressed, and is really questioning if she should continue living or not. But you're right, Ben's reactions, your initial take is like, oh, this guy is a sociopath, but I almost feel like that's by design.
Before you get to that, I'm not so sure that she's even suicidal, though. I think she's just depressed because she talks about how she fears dying. She does mention that. Yeah, but she just says she wished she never existed.
And I don't want to jump around too much, but because of those things that you're citing, it always put the doubt in my mind that she did commit suicide versus what I'm going to go with as my official theory with the we'll get to that in a while. But when Ben does, when he says like, I haven't seen anybody, crying, my first reaction was, oh, this guy sounds like a sociopath. But then looking deeper, I was like, I think it's just also another, even if he's the sociopath, which you can argue maybe he isn't, I think it highlights, like you said, like that divide of like, oh, I don't have these issues, like I never like had any, like I don't have these like emotional hiccups, as maybe Ben would say. Mm-hmm. And because like he keeps using the word like play and fun, like, oh, I'm focused on fun. And actually what I learned was that like the word, because we get the subtitle translation to say fun, interesting, apparently it's the same word, and like what his lines are actually the same Korean word. So fun, interesting, play, like it's actually he's really just saying fun. So I found that interesting where, like you said, that one of our, I think, limitations unfortunately is that we don't know Korean. But I think it's actually an important lens to view this film, I think, if you have the ability to, because I see that, especially when we get to the greenhouses stuff, that it is a factor, like you said, of this cinematic experience. But you're right, like my first reaction was, oh, this guy is like a sociopath. It's interesting how in this movie, if you just take the surface level, you can almost watch this movie and go like, oh yeah, it's a movie about XYZ, and that's what happened. But once you dig deeper and you start having that doubt creep in, you're like, wait, was that what happened? Like you start like now like questioning yourself, because
it's almost like as if the cat's there, but you're not so sure, right? Exactly. There is that doubt. It's like, is that really what happened? There's always that, but it's like the cat's a great metaphor because there's evidence that something's there. It's just you're not quite sure what.
Exactly. And I found that scene, okay, I was thinking a serious aspect, but I will say that like I got hungry like watching that scene too because the food looked good. But a little side note there. I've actually had like, I mean, you've had Korean barbecue too, but I had this one unique experience because I went to college with somebody who his family was Korean, and actually it was like the first time, because usually when you go to these Korean barbecues, you pretend you know what you're doing, you put the meat there. It was the first time that like he actually he did all the work. And actually he told me that like in his family, yeah, they take turns like doing the Korean barbecue because they have a whole setup at home. And I was like, oh wow, that's super interesting. And actually, now that you mention it, I should probably mention him this movie and see what his take is. But it's yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Korean barbecue. So, that was a little.
That's a little off tangent, but all right.
A little off tangent.
I mean, I agree. I'm a big fan of Korean food as well.
Even though I don't think they were actually eating Korean barbecue in that scene, but I just wanted to.
They were. I believe they were eating ramen, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they were eating ramen. But it just my whole point is that when I watched that scene, I suddenly got hungry. I will say, which is to give a little personality to this podcast.
Yeah, I personally did not because I don't know. Based on the subject matter of what they were talking about, food was like the last thing I was really paying attention to.
Yeah, which I find that interesting because I was curious to understand myself why I had that reaction. Maybe because I like food, but I will say with that scene is like I said, super important, and like and then you also see if you look how they're seated too, right? Like Jong-seo's on one side, you feel that there's that separation too, right? Ben's on the other, and also there's also a camera angle that they switch to.
Yep.
Where you see like Ben is like the focus, and so I think those two things show me that there's a separation between their world and his world.
Well, it's really interesting, right? Because I don't think it's just that. Because if you look at the camera angle through the duration of the film, it's very interesting. Because at first you see Jong-seo sort of focused, and as Jaime's talking about her experience there, it's Jong-seo's sort of his perception and his focus and trying to understanding is from him to trying to figure out Jaime, right? And I think that's what it was at the beginning of the film, right? But then once Ben starts speaking, you see the camera frame flip and Jaime's out of the screen, and it's from Jong-seo to Ben. And so I think that's sort of also a shift, and that camera work is also a shift to say that from this point on, or sort of going forward, it's going to be Jong-seo trying to focus and trying to figure out Ben and sort of what he's about.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess
there's some very good directorial choice.
Yeah, because there's I was thinking of the scene where like it's behind both Jaime and Jong-seo, but you're right. I think it's either before or after. I can't remember, but like there is a scene where it's just them, and she's totally out of the picture. So this is one of those films where like the camera angles matter a lot, and you don't always. I think they always matter, but this one really like
they really do.
You really do notice it.
Yeah, they're very purposeful in terms of how they choose them.
Yes.
Then what ends up happening? Oh, so right after that, or right around that certain point in time, or maybe we missed this, but there is a specific moment where Ben goes to the. Oh, I'm sorry, not Ben. Jong-seo goes to the courtroom, and you see that sequence of where he's hearing his father's arraignment. So I wanted to get your opinion on why does Jong-seo look away? Why can't he look at his father? There's clearly something there.
Yeah, this I could definitely do another tangent here. My interpretation, because like you said, I've been watching a few K-dramas on the side over the last couple of years. My sense is that, I think it's the same in our own society, those who are kind of like abnormal, unless they fit nicely into like a category, like, oh, this guy's abnormal, but he's a mathematical genius, so we'll just let him have a whiteboard and go away. I think our society in general don't do well with mental health issues. And so I think also in
what evidence do you have that he has mental health issues?
Oh, I mean, I think the fact how he communicates with his own lawyer or doesn't communicate with his lawyer. Also,
in what way would that indicate that? If anything, he's just proud.
I know, and I think that's why this is the beauty of the film, where like it's interpretative. But maybe I'm coming with my recency bias watching some of these K-dramas where those who are not like deemed normal, they're kind of like demified. I think to a degree we do the same in our own society, but I have the sense that it's even more so in Asian
basically
cultures.
If you won't play ball, if you're
and speaking of the own Asian culture, and I'm going to inject some personal interpretation here. Speaking of the Asian culture I come from, and I know it's not something that is viewed it's not talked about. it's
Just
not
for
discussed.
listeners to sort of understand from your father's side, is Vietnamese culture.
Yes. Yeah, and it's something that like I don't want to get into too many details, but we've had the topic of mental health in my own family, and it's not something that's discussed, and it's not something that's really, it's put under the rug. And honestly, if they were, let's say, get arrested, I hate to say it, but I bet I have family members would probably be like, well, it was bound to happen. So
Yeah, I
so
mean, I don't think that's just an Asian. I don't think that's sort of unique to just Asian culture. I will say, from my experiences growing up, on my dad's side with Mexican culture, it's kind of the same way, where it's sort of something you just don't really talk about in terms of sort of mental health disorders or just mental health in general. And for the longest time, it was that way here. If you ever see, so this is a quick little tangent. If you ever see the show Mad Men, sort of shows a deconstruction of the 1960s society here. If you ever saw a shrink, that was very taboo, right? Because you never wanted to, and I've talked to my parents about that because they are from the 50s and 60s. It's like, oh yeah, one of the biggest things is you never wanted to be labeled as crazy. Like that was it, right? And it's only recently that I think we've really started to come to terms with mental health. But I can see how other societies like Korea might lag behind in that.
Yeah, and I mean, one can still argue that the mental health aspect even here isn't really like.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's gotten better.
I think why, like, maybe in a cinematic form or in a storytelling form, why it seems so like abrupt, and maybe in a Korean show or TV or Asian TV show, is because how like hierarchical the society is, that it's a little bit more like ruthless, I would say, and it just plays better maybe on the cinema screen. But you're right, where like this whole movie is about like second guessing your own like your own assertion. So you posed a good question around. We don't get any real hard evidence that he has any of these issues. That he was just arrested for some vandalism. I believe it's vandalism, right? I'm trying to go by my memory.
Yeah, and you were also an assault, I believe.
An assault, and so for all you know, he was just hungry and
proud.
Needed food, yeah, or proud or anything like that, right? But I think this is why this movie is like so brilliant, where it almost nudges my own like biases, and then makes me believe one thing, and then I have to second guess myself. And I think there's a lot of scenes in this movie where that happens, right? Your first assertion, or even Jong-seo later, where he has his own, like, he's leaping conclusions too.
I will say I don't think he has mental health issues. This is just my personal opinion. I think it's more that it's just him being a very powerful man and coming from a patriarchal society, right? Where I think you're supposed to show that level of masculinity, if you will, being type A assertive. And I think more evidence is pointed to that. And I think where the disconnect lies is that Jong-seo had to go back to his village to help with his father. But I think that scene sort of symbolizes that there was definitely a strain in the relationship, and that Jong-seo sort of abandoned his father because he left out of Panju, out of the village, and then had to come back. So I think that sort of not being able to look is just indicative that he left, and it doesn't really have a good relationship with his father.
Yeah, I will say that, like, even if he doesn't have mental health, he was an oddball, because I know there's that
very
scene.
Oddball.
You're mentioning that scene where, like, he comes to the farm and he actually has to get some signatures, and the guy says, "You're making me sign," and he signs it anyways, which actually surprised me a little bit. He was like, I don't even agree with this statement. Like, your father was not communal. Like, it's a farming community.
Yeah, he was mean, but I think
he was the oddball. And I will say that, like, from what I know about, like, social structures over in Asia, that is you're kind of like black. What's the term? Like black sheep. Like, if you're like that, like, you're kind of blacklisted. So there is a high incentive. Like, we come from a society where, like, if you have a guy that's, you would normally, maybe this is changing, if you're just a loner, they're just like, oh, that guy just likes to be by himself. There, it seems like if you're just a loner that's too alone, like, you're not seen as somebody's part of the group. And actually, speaking of the film we just covered, we see that even in the Grave of the Fireflies, right? Like, what are you doing for the community? We're in a war effort. You should be part of it. You should be interlinked with us. And if you're not socialized correctly, the safety net is minimal for you. We don't care. You can die and whatever. So I think the scene in the courthouse, that little scene with the farmer signing the document of like, oh, he was actually a good citizen, but he says otherwise.
So
I think that touches upon that, like you said, that maybe the current social structure of Korea.
I will say I think the farmer signs that petition not necessarily for the dad, more for the son, because I think that's more the perspective where he's coming from. Was like, oh well, it's his son trying to do something good for his dad. Yeah, I'll sign it.
Yeah, I can agree with that interpretation.
Yeah, because there's no evidence to say he would have done it just because of the dad.
Yeah, it seemed like they didn't like him. That's what was hinted strongly.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple other scenes that sort of take place, I believe, in between there, but I'm trying to remember. We're sort of going a little chronological. But the next big sort of scene is when you end up going, or the next sort of big sequence between the three of them is when they, you see Ben and Jaime calls Jong-seo and says, are you at home? I thought you would be. We're going to be there pretty soon. And so the next sequence is them all three at the farm of Jong-seo. And during that time, they decide to smoke some marijuana. And right after that, essentially what happens is Jaime ends up sort of in a state of being high. She ends up taking off her top and sort of dancing freely. And I think we talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to see if any of your perspective has changed onto what the director was trying to get across with that scene.
Let's talk about that scene, but because we are jumping around, after this scene, let's go back to because we skipped the scene where they go to it's on the nose, right? What's a metaphor, right? They go to Ben's apartment, and also
that's right,
and that's very close to the scene where she does the she does the performance.
Actually, so let's talk about that scene first. Okay. You're right. So it was very awkward. You talk about what was more interesting on that scene is it's sort of when you see Ben's apartment, it gives you more evidence on how different Ben and Jong-seo is, right? And really where this is brought up is with the idea of cooking. Ben says, I love to cook because, I can make anything the way I want it. And you contrast that to Jong-seo's response. He's like, oh, I can only make like a dish or two. He's like, I don't really cook that often. I think that was more evidence that they wanted to give. And then you see Ben's apartment is just super luxurious, super nice, and spacious, which is not very customary for a lot of Koreans' living situations. And then sort of you could tell Jong-seo's still very uncomfortable with Ben and the idea. And he says at one point that with the idea, sort of how it leaps in, Jaime doesn't understand metaphor, which we'll get into in a second, but he essentially, Jong-seo asks the two where the bathroom is, and he goes in, and you see something that's pretty interesting there. Some things that get brought up in the restroom that will be sort of brought up later in the movie. But one is that of a makeup box, which sort of puzzles Jong-seo a bit. And the second, there's a drawer right beneath that where it seems like it's a lot of accessories for females. And I think he was a little like stunned by that. You can't really tell if he's a player at that point or not. Like it almost seemed like they were like trophies that he's kept for like women he's seen. You don't know as an audience member at that point.
Yeah, I think Jong-seo in that point in the story, I think he thinks the guy's a player because I can see that Jong-seo likes to leap to conclusions, which is the audience too. But yeah, the makeup kit freaks him out. That's also the same scene where you mentioned earlier where he's on the balcony and he makes the Great Gatsby reference.
Yeah.
Just like in the food, the restaurant scene, he makes the Faulkner reference. What I found interesting about that scene is the on the nose metaphor, but also when he says like he likes to prepare food, but he also says it reminds me of the people when they would decorate sacrifices, and then she makes the joke like, oh, are you like cooking, like you're cooking these great things because you're a god supposedly, and he just laughs it off because that's what Ben does, he's super cool.
Yeah.
But you're right, like the metaphor thing was really on the nose, but I think at that point, if you're not getting that this movie is basically a metaphor, then you're going to be lost the rest of the way. But
go ahead.
I was gonna say the bathroom scene sets up for later. A lot of these scenes in the beginning, they just set up perfectly. But I like that scene with because I want to talk a little bit about Ben now. This is a good entry point.
Mm-hmm.
When he makes the Great Gatsby reference and the money of we have all these new Koreans, or he says all these people.
We have all these Gatsbys in Korea.
Yeah, we have all these people. We don't know what they do, but they have a lot of money. And I think going back to Ben's character here, so I just little segue. The performance is really good by Stephen Wan because if you think about it, he's able to play this kind of like, because we're not implicitly told he's like Americanized, but he has all these kind of like, I would say like Western neoliberalist capitalistic attributes of like, he dresses cool, he's a great apartment, he drives a nice car, women love to be around him because he's fun.
He's got a big social circle.
Big social circle. He's laid back. He's sociable, even though there's little hints that
there's awkward.
There's something missing in the head a little bit, and I think it's kind of like he plays this cool representation of like modern capitalism. Like he is like this. If you had to pick like no matter of ethnicity or whatever, but like maybe like a stereotype ideal for most people would be this kind of like individual, right? He has money. He looks like he's comfortable. He looks healthy. He looks, that he's attractive. Like it's not like he has barely any deficiencies. It's almost too perfect, right? And you see that it kind of like it's getting to John. Like it's almost at this point in the movie, I get the hint that like Jong-seo is looking for ways to like somehow demonize him, which is why I think later he's so willing to believe like this guy is like a freaking, sociopath,
Yeah.
But I'm curious about your take of the interpretation of Ben, like his representation of cool capitalism and of kind of like the modern, affluent individual.
I mean, I don't know if there's much I can add to there because I think you're pretty spot on in terms of his character. The other thing, like, I think they wanted to make him sort of as unrelatable to most people as possible, especially Koreans, in that apparently his sort of within the character himself, and I don't speak Korean, I don't know all the intricacies, but there's something that even they say within his language, the way he speaks Korean, it's sort of off. And that was meant to sort of make people sort of question his character a bit too, to make it more unsettling, if you will.
And so, I see what you're saying. Like he's like to use another personal reference, he's kind of like a diaspora, maybe like he's coming in with all the foreign money and the foreign.
Yeah. Well,
what I like is that
I mean, when you're first introduced, it's him coming from Kenya, right? So he's clearly a well-traveled individual.
Yeah, it's kind of like they don't want to tell us that he's been like Americanized, but that's all the insinuation, right? Like, oh, he's learned from like the modern schooling and like he knows how to work in this modern world, while we're still trying to figure it out. Or the people who are poor, no matter if you're in Korea, America, Africa, like you're not, you haven't mastered the game yet.
Yeah.
Or Kenya.
So one of the other scenes, I forgot to bring this about. You see, essentially at one point where Jong-seo is invited to go to dinner with Jaime and Ben at some restaurant, but it's also with them and a bunch of Ben's friends, right? And at one point, we've talked about this before, essentially Jaime is talking about her experiences being in Africa. And it's interesting because within the scene, Jong-seo and Jaime are the only two that are of like lower socioeconomic status. All the rest are, you could tell, like Ben, kind of like new money, the yuppie Koreans that just live like elites do. And so and this is where class really gets brought up a bit, is that you see Jaime describing sort of her experience in Africa and how the Bushmen in Africa dance. And then you see one of Ben's friends be like, oh, like, can you show us like how to dance? Can you dance for us, basically? And so you see, and she starts dancing in front of all of them, and they're kind of admiring, almost like she's sort of entertainment and pleasure. It was very unsettling, or it's a scene that kind of made me pretty uncomfortable, because you could see it was almost like they were viewing these poor people as sort of tokens to them in a way. And I think this was one scene where Jong-seo sort of sees the same thing that I was getting out of that sequence. And you could tell that I think in his mind, he could see that there might be something malicious going on between Ben and Jaime, or Ben's intentions for Jaime.
Yeah, I mean, this is why this movie is profound, because this is definitely universal. I think because you see this in many films and many books and literature, like when somebody's moving between social classes for whatever, like temporarily, like whether that's the waiter serving somebody who's rich, or any other social dynamic, or like maybe you have a rich family member but you're poor. you see that like it's in the air, right? Like, oh, this is our charity case, like, okay, like we'll be nice
Yeah, in
and
a way.
friendly, but like
Well,
have her perform because it's funny. And honestly, let's be realistic, let's be honest. Like, there's a lot of people in our today American society even that they view poor people as people who are just there to
for
lift
their
my boots,
entertainment in a way.
yeah, like be my
So,
serfs, yeah.
I mean, I made this analogy to you before, but there's a really silly comedy movie, but it still proves this point. It's called Dinner for Schmucks with Zach Galifianakis. Came out like 10 years ago. But in the whole thing, the whole point of the movie, even though it's a comedy, is about these rich, affluent people that are gathering for a dinner party, and they have a bet every year that they could bring the most entertaining, obnoxious guest for their own pleasure, right? And so these are sort of the weirdos of quote unquote weirdos of society that they find and they bring for the sake of trying to one up one another. It's essentially kind of the same idea as this within this sequence of the film. But yeah, I think it's sort of a universal where you see some people when they get to that level of society, they kind of look down on everyone else, and at that point, it's almost like just people watching.
Yeah, and this is something that you see definitely with the even people who are, because they even say this about like people who are like, let's say they just got rich and they go to, let's say, the Princeton, golf club. And Princeton's, for our viewers, if we have any international ones, Princeton's one of the richest cities
in New Jersey.
New Jersey and potentially the United States. But like they're old money usually, so like people who are rich, if they even like get in, they see that there's still different mannerisms. And,
well, it's the idea of old money versus new money.
Yeah, and I know that in England, actually, this is even worse. Where like the aristocrats have been sending their kids to the same kind of like elite school, so they actually speak English, British English, in a different way than commoners, and also obviously the working class. And it's because they're taught to speak like literally differently, and they have even like a different, like, not dialect, but like they have a different way of using sentences and words. And I remember, so a little short story, and this is maybe a good example of what you're talking about. In 2010, I went to London, and my dad met me there, and he had a friend that he taught at the same university at, and he was married to a actually, and she's not even like from the royal family, but her ancestry was like, she was like the handmaiden of one of the Queen Victoria. So they actually had like a plot of land, a small house because of regulations, so they didn't have a huge home. But she asked me, "What are you learning?" And I'm like, "What's learning?" I actually felt like, "What the, like? Okay, not just I'm American, but what is this learning?" And she gave me this look like, "You don't know what that means." And her husband's American, so he was like, "Oh, we would say, what are you mean?"
What are you studying?
But even normal Brits don't say like, "What are you learning?" Like learning as in like what? Like they usually say like, "What are you studying? What's your specialization?" And even her, I met one of her sons, and he also spoke English in a very like when you watch Downton Abbey, he spoke English like that, and I was like, whoa, this is the 21st century,
Yeah.
And like the house is
it's what you call like how you would say here, like country club lingo.
Yeah, and her kid got to like, he was like doing a leap year in India, like it was like a different world.
A leap year in England, of course.
And what's interesting is that the house is puny, right? And he's an American, the husband. And he goes like, "Oh, you see all the way those trees?" I'm like, "Yeah, we technically own all the land from there to here." I'm like, "What?" It was, and they lived in Kensington, which is one of the, if you're not aware, it's one of the wealthiest areas in England as well. So I was just, and then like they just had it by coincidence. Like I guess they were doing laundry, must have been that week. But you see these school uniforms, and it looks like the Hogwarts, and
sure.
and that's a little personal of like, you could definitely feel like definitely out of place because it was a small interaction and they were welcoming, but I was like, this is a world that I don't understand.
Sure.
And to your point, I think this happens in real life, and it is uncomfortable. It is very awkward. I can attest to that. So.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the whole point where this film is very universal in that it takes place in Korea, but I think you can relate to a lot of the sort of the sequences and themes that they were trying to touch upon in this movie. But anyway, so yeah, we sort of covered a couple of the scenes that we sort of missed. But going back to that sequence that I brought up earlier of Jaime dancing topless while she was high, I wanted to get what your interpretation of that was.
Yeah, when they were high and she undressed herself, right? Yeah. This is a loaded scene, and I can now talk for 20 minutes of her. I will say that like the thoughts running through my head were because the Korean flag being in the background is very important, and I think it represents that kind of like Korea. People forget that like Korea at the beginning of the 20th century was a rural society, like purely like even like the Seoul that we consider now modern and all the internet. It was a very like agricultural based society, and this changed in the space of a generation basically. And I think Jaime represents, I think, not just this confusion, but also how maybe they've, and this is the problem I think in many ways with modern capitalism, how now like everything is fetishized now, and like her body is now like fetishized. She got the plastic surgery, she got the augmentation. Like what is real, what is fake, of us, of our people, of our society, of our history. And I feel like her like dancing, let's say provocatively, but also in a way of like maybe breaking free, because I think they're also trapped by the confines of their kind of like
society.
Of society. Like you have to be this and that and this. So I think there's again, this is why I like this movie a lot. There is this contradiction in that scene by itself. Like it can mean she wants to be liberated, but also could mean that like they've sold themselves to something that like is taken away from the humanity of their people, their history, of just common decency, because let's be honest, even like markets are powerful and they're efficient or whatever, they do dehumanize the individual, right? You're a cog in a system and you're there for productivity output. And I think a lot of, again, this is where it's universal a little bit. I think a lot of people are now having a double take on that. Like, am I just somebody who produces something for a company for X amount of years,
Yeah, I think you're touching upon how, within the system that you are a part of, that your individuality at some level is stripped away.
And then on a physical note, like just on the scene itself, I did, because this is the first time you see her, like, well, you see her naked before, but I think in this scene it's more obvious that she also got breast augmentation, and you see that like, wow, she really like went full throttle. And I think it's something that's talked about in Korean society, that plastic surgery and just the eyelids, right? Just getting the eyelids to look more Western, I'm gonna say. And I think this scene also represents like, if women have these like self-esteem issues, and I can go on a whole different rant on K-pop because my brother's really into it. But it's also seen there, right? These are idealized individuals who are not real. They're trained from 10 years old to be a musician, basically, which is like in our society, that's not normalized, right? We don't train, like even if a girl has a dream of 8 years old to be a musician, we're not sending her to these schools to become like mass produced on scale, like commoditized, fetishized,
So just real quick, it's interesting you brought up K-pop because I'm going to go on a slight little fun fact. Apparently, the actor who plays Jong-seo, he was actually scouted to be trained as a K-pop singer. Yeah. But it just goes to speak of like sort of what you were trying to touch upon.
But that was my interpretation. This is like I said, 3 different themes, and I think that's why that scene is super, super like important. I'm interested in what you think a little bit, because I know you probably have a little bit of a different idea. But
a little bit. I think for the most part you're hitting the nail on the head. But I think even more than that, I think a lot of Koreans sort of feel, based on what I'm seeing from this movie, there's a lot of sort of angst. I think they feel repressed by sort of society's norms in a way, and that their freedom is sort of stripped away from them to an extent, right? They're expected to act certain ways. I think within this scene, sort of her being liberated and dancing, and you see the Korean flag in the background, I think it's sort of the frustration that some Korean youths feel, that they don't have the freedoms that they would want. And so it's her way of in the state of enjoying herself, of being free, right? She's even freeing herself from the constraints of her clothes. I think it's a very sort of symbolic moment in the movie.
And a little before that, I'm going to say her going naked scene, she shares the story of the well, which is important. She shares that she was she fell in a well and she was trapped there, and it was Jong-seo that brought her out. And then she makes the comment that like
he doesn't even remember.
He doesn't even remember this story. And then she goes inside, which becomes, again, the well becomes important later. But I thought that was also very it gets lost because I think the scene after her undressing and then that whole sequence is important, right? The well, her undressing, and then Jong-soo saying, "Hey, how come you find it so easy just to take off your clothes like a
Yeah,
whore?" You
there's
know?
something very key that we're missing in between them. At one point, Jaime goes inside, and so then it shifts. This is after she dances topless. She goes inside, and then it's just Jong-soo and then they have a very interesting conversation that reveals a whole hell of a lot.
Oh, the whole eyes on her thing. Okay, I guess you got more out of it than I did. But, go
What?
ahead. I guess you got more out of it than I did. That's go ahead. Go ahead.
The idea of like what his sort of secret is.
No, you're talking about like when they talk and he actually says like I'm really like I'm in love with her, right? I mean, it's part of the
It wasn't just
conversation.
that. Yeah, that was one of them. Like obviously, clearly, and this is that moment is when. I mean, it's clear for the audience member that that Jong-soo really is enamored. I will say with Jaime. He thinks of it as love. That's sort of to be you're not quite sure because I think he's just so emotionally stunted that I think what he thinks is love may or may not really be right. I think it's more like infatuation in a way, but yeah, he admits that to that, and Ben sort of chuckles when he hears that, and he's like, "Didn't you hear me? I said I'm in love, man." But he sort of just brushed it off, doesn't really acknowledge it. It's more like entertainment that this guy has like emotions for Ben, right? It was kind of weird, sort of his response. But in the same sort of sequence, Ben is like, "Hey, I want to confess to something to you," and he's like, "This is part of like me," but he's like I forgot how exactly they introduce it, but every couple of months he's like, I burn a greenhouse,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and he's like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, he's like, the Korean sort of countryside is riddled with abandoned greenhouses, but I find it sort of therapeutic to just make something disappear, and it's very key within that because this use of disappear the only other time you really hear it in the film is when Jaime talks about how she wished she had disappeared as if she had never existed.
That's true. It's in the greenhouse. Just to give the audience a take is I think it represents like the woman he meets, but also
Mm-hmm.
something I learned recently. I think it was yesterday is that in Korean like makeup, which we'll get into later, but makeup. So keep it in mind for the audience. Makeup and the word burn, it's a homonym. Like it's the
That's
word
interesting.
actually that's a word has a double meaning. So when we get there, just remember that because I'm going to bring it up again. But but you're right. The word like disappear, the burning, the greenhouse, like that's all. It's all so rich, it's you're like think
Yeah.
about this later in the movie.
So,
But it throws off Jong-soo. He's just like, what the heck? Like, what is this guy talking about?
and he's like, in fact, I've already sort of scouted. He's like, when was the last time you burned your last greenhouse? He's like, it was about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
He's like, so it's about time. And he basically tells him, he's like, in fact, my next target is one that's very close to here, one that's very close to you. And he's like, and so he's like, keep an eye out in the next couple days.
Yeah, and this is where he starts like obsessing himself about Ben, and he starts. I
Yeah.
think after we're gonna get into
No. Before that,
but he starts looking for greenhouses for
yeah.
sequence.
So he sort of keeps an eye out. He starts jogging every morning, looking at greenhouses and the abandoned ones in his area, and seeing if any of them have burned.
Yeah, he even tries to light one himself, which I found interesting. But before we get to there, let's talk about the
Yeah,
calling
I think that was
Jaime,
pretty deep too.
yeah, the Jaime horse scene.
Yeah.
And where you see her face totally turn. I'm curious about I think this says a lot about, I think, again, going back to you mentioned earlier, like patriarchal society, and and I mentioned objectification of women, but I'm curious, like, I'll let you take the floor on that one.
Yeah. So during that scene, essentially, Jong-soo, visibly upset, sort of tells her, "Why do you like undress in front of other men?" He's like, "Only, immoral women do that." Basically, is what he's sort of saying. And you see Jaime like feel like you see her face visibly hurt, and she gets in the car and doesn't talk with him. That's the last sequence you sort of see between those two characters. It's pretty interesting. But yeah, I think it's
Well,
just
not just his two characters. The last thing we see of her.
yeah, of her in the film, and it's interesting. There is a sense of entitlement with Jong-soo when he says that, like he wants her to be his in a way. But I think it just speaks more to the frustration of him. Like, why don't you feel the same way that I do about you?
Yeah. Yeah. I pretty much agree. I don't really have. I thought this scene was like we dissect a lot of scenes, but this one felt like pretty straightforward. Or like,
Yeah, it was about as
yeah,
straightforward as I think.
But I know you wanted to talk about him burning and then trying to like when he goes around the greenhouses. So.
I mean, I think at one point he sort of tries to light a greenhouse on fire, then he doubles back. I think part of that is just getting more and more, giving you more and more evidence about how different he and Ben really are. Because I think he wanted to feel what that would be like to make something just disappear, but he couldn't pull the trigger. I think it just speaks to the personality difference between Jong-seo and Ben. There's probably some more deeper level, but go ahead.
And before we actually in him chasing, that's when we get our first, in my opinion, unless there was one I missed, our first dream sequence, right? There was the scene after she leaves in the car. There is that scene of the greenhouse on fire with the child watching, which I think is supposed to be Jong-seo, but I was just like...
It is supposed to be Jong-seo. In that case, I think that is representative of his mom leaving him when he was a child.
Interesting. I also thought
I could be wrong.
I also thought it could represent that, like, because I'm looking on hindsight, it could also represent that something happened with Jaime. So like something is like irreversibly changed, you know. Because
it could be. I think it's more that whether he realizes it or not, it's the idea that his mom left. Because it's like another woman that has disappeared out of his life.
Yeah. I'm just following my own train of thought of where if the greenhouses represent women and this greenhouse is burning, I think this woman is disappearing from his life forever.
Well, it could be, yeah.
And that's just my take, but I'm following my own logic, and that's
from that sort of viewpoint. Why is it him as a kid?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It could represent like his mom abandoning him. Yeah, I think you can view it a lot of ways. Also, it could be that like. Maybe this marks the point where his innocence, because he crossed that line insulting her, maybe his innocence is gone, you know?
No, it could be. It could be a number of different...
Because it looks like you said, he's emotionally stunted. He doesn't know how to be Mr. Ben Suave. And it could be that, like, yeah, the innocent is, like, it's just this, like I said, this is already, like, I think it's already, we're on pace to be definitely longer than any of our other podcasts. But,
well, I mean, that was sort of expected. It's just there's too many things to touch upon within this film.
But
so...
Continuing on, yeah, I'll let you in a sec.
Sorry, continue. All right, go ahead.
To go like the last point on like him searching for the greenhouses, I thought that was intriguing because you start seeing that he might be like he's infatuated with Jaime, but he's also becoming obsessed about Ben. I think that's where you kind of get to think that like not a normal person is going around because of some offhand or not, maybe not offhand, but like some conversation you have. Like, oh, I'm gonna go look for all the greenhouses in my area, you know, because I want to see if you're burning them, and then I'm gonna. Like you said, I agree with your interpretation. We're like,
he gets obsessive because he's also lost contact with Jaime, and he gets that phone call from Jaime.
Yeah, that was like
right where you just hear a lot of muffled noises
and potentially a door closing. I'm curious about what you thought of that phone call.
You don't know. Something obviously went wrong.
Yeah.
I mean that's about like all you can really get out of it. You know something's not right.
Yeah, and then he gets all these phone calls throughout the movie, right? Because somebody's trying to reach him too. Yeah. And then he eventually answers, and it's his mother. But so you're gonna. So I let you.
I'm not so sure if that's his mother calling him all the time, or if that was just when he picked up at one time. I think it might have been his dad.
Interesting. Yeah, it's not really told to us, so it's like
it's not really told to us, but that's what I sort of thought or gathered, because he obviously has a strained relationship with his dad, and at one point he says, why don't you like answer? I think it's partly because his dad doesn't really talk to him anymore, but he kind of wants to, but he doesn't. I don't know, I could be very wrong there. Who else would be calling that random house though and not answering?
Yeah, it has to be one of the parents, because my initial gut reading was that it's the mom reaching about, like, because it's not explained to us, but they have a meeting later towards the end of the film where like we missed like the first part of the conversation or something, because she's talking about Jong-seo saying I'll take care of it, and she's like, with what money? And I'm like, what are we talking about? You know, like
I was very confused with that point.
We're talking about like something they both understand, but we don't have as a viewer we have impartial information, but it involves money, so I'm assuming it involves something with the dad or something with the
I think it's the money that he owes for the dad's debts.
Yeah, and so you're right. I think it might even be like both parents. It even could be a Jaime calling. You know, it could be all three. You don't really. It's not really
You
explained.
don't know, but Jaime would typically answer.
Yeah, he's infatuated. So I agree with you there. But anyways, I know I cut you off earlier. What is the other scene you want to get to?
So then it becomes to the point where they're starting to. I could be missing out like some scenes in between because this is a very long film and there's a lot that goes on. But then you see at some point that Jong-seo starts to stalk Ben, right? I thought one of the more interesting sequences in this was when he is, when Ben is eating at the art gallery and Jong-seo is just looking at certain things. Just wondering what your interpretation of that whole sequence was.
I'm trying to remember it. It's where he's like, it's where he's looking at Ben and Ben's sitting at the side of the edge of the table. Yeah. So that scene to me was something that really did stick out because I think Jong-seo, again, he likes to project, which I think is the audience also is more guilty of it. And he's looking at Ben. I think it clicks in his brain that Ben is like even though he's hanging out with all these people, he is a bit like separated for some reason. I think he's getting this intuition that like Ben is he's not just abnormal to me, but even to probably the social group he's in, that he's also like there's something also mysterious about him there too. And also you see that also, and this could be my interpretation, you see that sometimes Ben is yawning. And I think when he yawns, it means that he's not having fun anymore. He's getting bored.
Yeah.
And I think that also like feeds into Ben's character where he's preoccupied with the day-to-day, and if it's not entertaining, he wants to move on to something else.
Yeah, I think so. Why was I guess what was I asking? Why was Jong-seo looking at the painting?
Okay, so this, I actually had to do some reading on this. That that you're talking about the painting that's like the fire and the chaos, right? It seems like there was the painting's actually like I think it exists. Like it actually was I don't know what the name is, but it's an actual what's the term I'm looking for? Like it was an actual news story. I think there was some like housing. I don't know if it was public housing that got on fire, burnt down. I don't know if you're I don't know if you're looking it up. I'll keep talking while you're looking it up. But I think it's an actual painting and it's an actual current event. When I say current, I mean like the last 20 years. And I can't remember all the details, but I think there was that. It reminds me maybe potentially of that fire in London, or not London, but in England, where the public housing, because of they cut through regulations and they cut through they did cost cutting. It endangered people's lives, And I can't remember, like I said, I might be misspeaking on this particular event because I did a high level, but I didn't look too much into that particular event. But I think he's looking into that painting because I think the directorial message is there's something fundamentally off with our current society. And we because we commoditize not just personality, objectification, but also people themselves. When people perish or die for any event, we normalize it because, there's always a externality of cost to everything for progress, And I think he's questioning that. I'm hoping that you can find the event. Maybe I can look it up too.
I can't find the exact name of it, but yeah, I believe it was either 2008 or 2009. So that painting is basically representative of a massacre that happened. But essentially, what ended up happening is some housing activists wanted to essentially they were angered because the government ordered sort of the demolition of this building. I believe it was for like a new high-rise. Basically, it was a type of gentrification that was going on. And these activists were pretty upset, people who were residents of this building. So they staged a protest. Well, they went all the way to the roof. What ended up happening is that a fire ended up taking place in this building and a lot of people ended up dying. So that's the sort of painting of that Jong-seo is looking at. Now, what's interesting, and I think is more what they're getting at, is to him, some of these events, like Jong-seo really feels and identifies while looking at the painting. But to these people in this art gallery, it's just that, it's art, it's not life. And I think that's sort of the dichotomy that the director was trying to show and get across. It's like oh yeah, sort of the struggles of people they're sort of abstract to this level of society, whereas it takes on a whole different meaning to Jong-seo because he's actually living it.
Yeah, you're right. There was a gentrification angle, and I think that's a whole other topic, and we can get into it. And I think we did cover a little bit of Do the Right Thing gentrification in America.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the event was called Hong. I'm gonna butcher this. Hong San, maybe Hong San disaster. I know it was like Hong something, like YONGSAN or something like that. Because that painting was curious. But anyways, we can table that. But I know it's something relatively recent, right? Like the last 10, 15 years.
It was about 2009 is when it happened.
But yeah, you're right. That scene is.
It's pretty telling.
It's another important scene where like there's no dialogue. You're just seeing somebody like kind of look at a painting. And again, to your point, what you said earlier in our podcast, not having that knowledge, and I looked it up after the fact, but I feel like if I knew that before watching, it would have really hit. And I was actually confused until I did some like initial high level research.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it again speaks to the classism. And what I think I'm finding interesting about recent Korean cinema is that because the TV show I'm watching too touches upon the same like
a lot of class issues.
Not a lot of class issues, more about corruption of the elite. But you see, there's still, because of that, they still touch upon class issues. Mm-hmm. So I think again, it's very fascinating. But yeah, I guess we're heading towards the critical juncture of this movie. So I'll let you can, if you want to. I don't know what happened after that scene. That's where the chase scene happens, right? Or he's stalking him, right?
I think he's still stalking him up to this point. Now he stalks him outside of his. There's a lot of sort of stalking scenes within this movie. So you see him parked outside of his apartment at one point, just eating, and the cop rolls by. Like he's clearly like, "What the heck is this dude doing?" Just like staying there. But yeah, I believe at one point I can't remember if I'm missing a couple events, but he follows him as he's going out of the city in ruralness, right? And I think this is sort of the same sequence or timeline when you go and you see essentially Jong-seo is scared that he might be found out by Ben because there's a certain point where something happens and it ends up that he ends up having his truck in front of Ben's car. But he pulls over. Ben doesn't recognize him, so he feels safe. But then he hears some commotion at the top of the hill. So he decides to get out of his truck and walk up the top of the hill. And then you see the scene of, it's very fascinating, Ben looking at this lake or dam, and you see Jong-soo sort of standing up looking at Ben coming up from the mountainside.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get your interpretation of that.
I mean, yeah, it's one of those scenes where the disclaimer a little bit. I thought it was real until that part because I was like, there's no way that Ben can't feel him behind him, or at least have a sense. Like, even I look, to my rearview mirror sometimes and be like, what's behind me? And it's like, because you're right, there's a lot of stalking, but let's be honest, Jong-seo's chase scenes is not like James Bond. Okay, it's like pretty obvious that he's like right behind, and I thought Ben was onto it because he speeds away at one point, but he might have just been, playboy speeding. Yeah, that dam scene is it left me perplexed a bit because on the mechanics of it, I see Jong-seo just trying to see Ben has to be involved with Jaime. Like something happened. I can't reach her. She's disappeared. He's clearly guilty. He's already put this in his mind. Because later scenes, I feel like he's just putting things to kind of like do the confirmation bias. Like, oh, he clearly is the murderer. Because she's disappeared. I can't reach her, and she was clearly in love with me, which is a lot in his head, I think, to your point. I think like him, I honestly don't have any like concrete thoughts on that scene other than like, I think it being a dream sequence definitely blew my mind. but also that you see that like to Jong-seo's perspective, Ben represents almost like unbridled freedom, like true, like the freedom he would like to have. And I think and also something that's changed since the last time we spoke about this. Him being crouched, I think it's a representation of he's over idealizing Ben. Oh, Ben is this great guy. Ben is the mastermind. Ben is this, he's the reason, And I think the more I think about this movie, the more I see that Ben is a victim of modern society as much as Jong-seo is, even though maybe he has still better material needs, but he's spiritually like malnourished. But I know you have a stronger take on this scene, so I mean I'm talking in platitudes. So.
Yeah, I mean what was very interesting about that sort of wide angle shot of Jong-seo looking at Ben, looking at sort of the body of the lake or just nature. It's really interesting because my interpretation is just how they're viewing things. How the two characters view things is just from two different perspectives, right? In the scene, you're seeing, I guess, Ben just looking at nature, looking at sort of the big picture, whereas Jong-seo is looking at Ben through the lens of his Porsche, which I can't figure out what the Porsche is. Maybe it's just of him looking at him through jealousy of this materialism that Ben has or represents. Whereas Ben is looking at sort of nature, I guess, embracing all of the pleasures of within his life, if you will. I don't know if I'm necessarily wrong with that, but that's sort of what I got out of that.
No, I think in this movie it's hard to be extremely wrong because a lot of it's interpretative. So
the other scene we sort of skipped, or there were two scenes we sort of skipped about. One was when he goes and asks the landlady at Jaime's apartment to open her apartment to see if she's there, and you see that it's all clean.
Yeah, and then she also says there's no cat, right? She says there's no cat. There's
no
cat.
It's planting some doubts as to the truth of Jaime's statements, or it would. I think he's even doubting was Jaime even really there or part of his life to a degree.
Exactly, and I think the dream sequence is also supposed to place that doubt into the viewer. But you're right. Her apartment is
spotless. Her suitcase is still there, so which gives evidence she's in travel.
Yeah, exactly, because the landlord thought, if she's traveling or something. But Jong-seo said, like, she never keeps this apartment as clean, and if she has her suitcase there, why would she just leave that behind, right? So you're left to a lot of, like, what happened here, right? And I think it's easy to jump to the conclusions that you want to jump to.
Then the other part right after that is he goes and confronts Ben at some coffee shop in his neighborhood. And he's like, I wanted to talk to you about Jaime. And they're talking for a bit. And he said, by the way, I also wanted to ask you, he's like, did you ever end up burning down that greenhouse? And he's like, yeah. He's like, you're still thinking about that? He's like, yeah, I did. He's like, really? Well, I've looked at all the greenhouses around, and none of them burned. And he's like, oh. And he's like, well, maybe you weren't as diligent as you thought, because I definitely burned one like 2 days after. And so that sort of places that sinister conclusion in your head a little bit.
Exactly. And I think part of that, I think before that, because he's trying to like find Jaime, he also goes to the I guess Jaime's
the
family
parent shop
runs like a ramen shop or a noodle shop, and he's eating there. They recognize him and they talk to him, and he brings up the story of the well, and they're like, there's no well. And before we jump around about the well, they tell Jong-seo, if you see Jaime, tell her that she's not allowed to come back until like
she cleared her debts.
All her credit card and all these debts are cleared. Again, talking maybe about how like to look like you're happy, you have to spend so much and be a facade, and be fake.
Well, she has a lot of financial struggles, you know that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way she afforded all those surgeries without money, so it's implied, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, like the well thing is also intriguing. It's intriguing, right? Where Jaime's parents say there's no well. Jong-seo goes to where the well would be, and the owner said, like the guy that in the neighborhood says
there's no well. It was only his mother that said,
like, yeah, there's a well. Yeah. So it's like, again, to your point, it's like you have this contradictory information. So you're like, it's left to your own interpretation of what you think is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. And with that scene where the coffee shop scene, you can also tell that Jong-soo's kind of like ticked that like Ben is with a different chick, or he meets up with a different
Yeah, a
woman,
new one.
and he's just like, wow, these are just like dime a dozen.
They're commodities to him,
Yeah.
basically. But yeah, so we're getting pretty close to like the end of this film, but I think the sort of there's a couple of things that happened with like him returning to the courtroom, and so some things that weren't as consequential. It was more his father like not willing to actually apologize because his pride gets in the way, and he gets arraigned. I think the 18-month sentence or something like that for an attack on a civil servant. But one of the latter scenes is it's I believe at dusk time, and you see again Jong-soo in the beat up old truck, sort of stalking Ben, and then he gets a call from Ben, which unsettles him. So
I actually jumped on that scene because like he calls him, and then he knocks on the window, and I was just like, what the? I was like, whoa. So yeah, that was
a little unsettling.
As a scene itself, it definitely gave me a little jump. But I think also tells you, the viewer, that Ben has been sort of aware, or
suspicious,
that he's been tracked, and it led me. And I remember that scene where in the highway where he breaks us off. I think that was like my first hint that like I think he knows that, like, even though it seemed like it was a dream sequence. Again, you don't know what's real, what's not real, but it was like my first sense that Ben probably feels that like he's being followed, and then it was confirmed when he like clearly got Jong-seo on the flat foot, because even he jumped like I did, like what the heck. And then he mentions that and I want to bring this line up because I think it's important later, but he mentions that like he wants to talk to him about Hai Mei, right? And again, we're going to discuss probably a lot of scenes, but if you remember when he's about to leave, Ben says, didn't you want to ask about Hai Mei? And he's like, no, because he already has the conclusion in his head that he wants to believe, his truth. Everybody wants to believe their truth, so he wants to believe his truth, and he doesn't want to ask any questions that he believed already answered.
Yeah.
But before we get there, right? He invites him in, and
so he invites him in, and he's so Ben has a lot of groceries at this point, or like a couple bags.
Yeah.
And
he's throwing a party.
Yeah. Well, no, he doesn't say a party. He says more like a gathering, if you recall his exact verbiage, right?
It's a potluck, yeah.
Right, it's a potluck. It's everything, like, basically he wants to sort of contradict, and he's very wishy-washy as to like what's actually going on. But basically, what did you say? It's more like a gathering of friends, if you will. Yeah. Like some very like silly verbiage for that. It's essentially a party. But at that point in time, it's just it's Ben and Jong-soo. And at one point, basically they're talking for a bit. And Jong-soo asks Ben, can I use your restroom? Sure. And then you go ahead and and he also notices that he has a cat. And he's like, oh, it's a stray cat that I found that I've taken in. And he's like, okay, well, that's kind of weird but interesting. It's something different, right?
Yeah.
But then Jong-soo ends up going to the restroom, and I believe he doesn't see the makeup box there at that point. But what he does is he pulls open the drawer and he sees a watch that resembles Hai Mei's watch. You're led to believe that it is, but I believe at another point you actually see another woman with like that same kind of watch as well. So you're not quite sure. That's part of that what's supposed to cast some doubt into your head too.
And that's actually an important detail, because like that watch that Hai Mei gets is because she rigged the whole stupid what's it called, like the game,
it's not lottery. It's a raffle. She rigs the raffle.
She rigs the raffle. But yeah, it's implied basically that this watch is like, obviously at these like cheap raffles, you're not getting like a unique
quality.
Item. They're buying like something in like bulk. So again, it could have been her watch, but it could have been another girl's watch or anybody's watch. And yeah, it's sort of implied too. But in Jong-soo's perspective, that's her watch, and like he already has evidence starting to piece together to him.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is you as a viewer are introduced that she's not the only one with a watch. When he's looking or asking questions about Hai Mei, and he actually goes and talks to one of the girls that was working with her, and she had that exact same watch on her wrist. I don't know if you saw that.
I missed that detail.
Yeah.
But I did recognize that it's hinted that like
There's a lot of watches like that.
There's a lot of that watches, and also like again, like if it's a raffle, like especially that cheap kind of raffle, there's no way that's like a unique item. But what's interesting is Jong-seo is already like that's all ignored in his mind. You can tell that like he doesn't like it's all just blurred away, you know. And he already is reaching the final conclusions he wants to.
Yeah, so he sees the watch there, right? And at the same time, when he's looking at the watch, piecing everything together, you hear some commotion about how that new girl that Ben is with opens the door, and you hear Ben saying, "Close the door quickly, otherwise the cat will run out," and she's not quick enough, and the cat runs out. And so then you're led to them going into the parking garage searching for the cat, and Jong-seo follows them after a few minutes down, and he sees the cat, and he's trying to get the cat's attention, but it won't come until he sort of pieces something in his head, and he's like, he calls the cat Boyle. Because that was the other thing. Ben says that he never named the cat. He's still trying to figure that out. And he thought that naming the cat was harder than he thought it would be. But he calls the cat Boyle, and wouldn't you know it, after the second time saying Boyle, that cat comes to him. Right? And so in his mind, in your mind, you're wondering, is that just a coincidence, or is that really Jaime's cat?
Exactly, right? Like, did it respond just to anything, or did it respond specifically to that name?
Yeah.
And then that he gets the cat, and then the other I guess the other
guests arrive
for the gathering, and then
Jong-seo just feels so out of place there. And
he's gonna leave, and Ben tells him like, no, stay and enjoy yourself, blah 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 blah, right?
And he's like, you also wanted to ask me about Jaime, and he's like, no, he's like, I figured it out, or something like that.
Well, he didn't say I figured it out.
I know.
No, I don't need. No, I'm good.
I don't have any more questions.
But in his mind, he
really
jumped to the conclusions he wanted to, right?
Yeah.
And which I found interesting, because I was curious about what he was going to ask him when he had the opportunity, and then
you don't know
how Ben would answer, but he didn't care at that point, so he just left.
Yeah.
And then go ahead.
So in the final scene, you see Ben pulled up in his Porsche in some farm in the countryside, and you see him go towards Jong-seo, who arrives in his truck, and he's like, "Hey, you said you wanted to talk," and he said, "Where's Jaime?" You said Jaime was here as well. And then at that point, you see the repeated stabbing and the murder of Ben by Jong-seo. Now, what was interesting is that he sent Ben's body into the car, his dead body, and he was going to light it on fire, but he sees that all the blood on his clothes, and he decides to strip naked before lighting it on fire, before returning into his truck. So I wanted to see or get your interpretation as to what was sort of this, if there was any symbolic meaning that you saw there.
Oh, definitely symbolic meaning. But before we get into that, I think what's interesting about that scene is that, first of all, it takes you by surprise, because
you're like, whoa.
Ben is asking, like, because Ben, by his tone, it seems like he's also intrigued, maybe like even at a selfish level, like, ooh, like, you're with Jaime. Because there's, again, if he's in it, if he didn't, like, let's say he wasn't the reason for her disappearance, like he wasn't the one that killed her.
He had some involvement.
Is he there for curiosity? But if he didn't kill her, then he genuinely is just intrigued as a kind of sinister player.
Or it could be to not, if he didn't show, then that would be sort of an admission of some guilt.
Exactly. So, but what's interesting, when he gets stabbed and he's like struggling, and actually that scene where he's like kind of hugging Jong-seo.
Oh yeah.
You see that like his face is like in shock / also like, I mainly saw shock, but I don't know if it was a shock that he was getting killed, or that Jong-seo had the courage to do that, or just a lot to process, and just that one.
Or the shock that he thought he was untouchable.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And you're left to your own devices as a viewer to what you want to read into that.
Yep.
But yeah, you're right. Like, he puts him in he's in the car, and he wants to light it up, but he's like, I have blood everywhere, right? And so he gets naked, and he lights it, and the last real scene is him walking all the way to his white truck, but naked, right?
So what's interesting is you see earlier in the film, he tries to light a greenhouse on fire, but he can't do it. But in the end, he brings himself and actually burns the whole thing of the Porsche and Ben in there. So I wanted to get your sort of your perspective on this, on what was going on.
Yeah, so my take on this specific scene, there's a couple things. One is him killing Ben was, now I look back on it, was the logical conclusion for Jong-seo because he was that obsessed and infatuated, in my interpretation, the idea of Jaime, not who she was really. And that happens to a lot of guys. And he stabs Ben. He lights him lighting the car on fire. I think to me represents like, a rejection of kind of like that modern capitalistic culture of like,
Yeah.
This, after all this, it's just a facade. It's just manipulation of money, women, of the fetishization of culture. And him being butt naked is almost like a return to savagery.
Yeah.
Of like, you know what, I don't need clothing.
Primalness.
Yeah, I'm basic instincts, But I also think it's profound sadness because I think throughout the film, Ben keeps asking him what you're going to write about, and he's like, I don't know yet.
Well, he also said that he wanted him to write about. He wanted Jong-seo to write about him.
Yeah, so maybe he'll write after. It's not told to us. Maybe he'll write about this story in his book. But I think the sense I got is that, like, if you look where Jong-seo was in the beginning and where he ended up, he really didn't end up in any place better, and now he's potentially on the hook for murder, right? But what him walking away is kind of like I see that there's relief, but also maybe anguish, Like it's one of those things where like, because you can feel both, right? You can feel like, oh, I'm relieved this is over, but I also feel sad that it is over, like. And so I think my interpretation is that on a symbolic level is that, he's able to purge this, but it doesn't come at no cost to him.
Yeah, so I think on sort of the more personal level, it was obviously like his. It was a scene of revenge of him, but if you look at it from a class, it's a rejection or the final frustration of sort of the lower caste being taken advantage of by like the elites, if you will. I think it was just the point of the tipping point.
We also skipped an important detail which hints at to potentially what Ben's career is. There is that scene where he's putting makeup on one of the newer girls that he's.
Oh yeah.
And she's one that speaks Chinese.
He's dolling her up.
Yeah, and the makeup kit that you see earlier is in that scene, which leads you to believe that maybe he's not the murderer of Jaime, but at least he's definitely involved in some shady human trafficking business. And explains the money, explains a lot of the other details. And also, it's a bit creepy. He's putting makeup on her, I will say.
It was bizarre.
But maybe some men are into that. But I think it's a hint because, like I said, this movie, nothing is ever like told to you directly.
Explicitly said.
Yeah, but it's implied, and this implies that like whatever he's involved in, whether that's human trafficking, prostitution, or just maybe like escort service, he's involved in something, and that's how he's explaining his like he has.
Yeah, I mean.
But also explains the greenhouses every 2 months and why girls come and go and why he has tokens of.
I think some people believe that he murdered Jaime. I'm not of this conclusion. I mean, she had a lot of debt issues. She needed to make money. And I think Ben and I think a lot of people who are involved in human trafficking, they prey on people who are in vulnerable positions, much like Ben does. And I think it also explains why he travels a lot, like to Kenya, why he's been to a lot of other places. I think, unfortunately, it's part of the business. And he also says, like, what he does is, like, he's like, the lines are blurred between work and play. He's like, I'll just say this. He's like, I play, right? So he enjoys what he does. I think part of it is that, yeah, he gets these women involved in human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. I think it's highly hinted at that.
Yeah, and again, I think it's almost a perfect career for that character because one of the themes I see in this movie is, again, the fetishization of individuals, the dehumanization of kind of like modern society.
Well, and I think it's also part of the underbelly of our capitalistic society that they want to point out that he's involved in.
And one of the professions that probably represents very well that a human being is just represent is just a commodity is human trafficking, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's also what is it? The prostitution is always sort of said as like the oldest human profession.
Yeah, even though I would say that that kind of prostitution is rough, but
Oh yeah.
I'm curious about what you like. So how like that ending is very like jaw dropping. So I guess like on your first viewing, I guess we only watched it once so far, but on that first initial take, how did you process that? I know for me it was like whoa.
I mean, it was a powerful scene, man. I mean, you see it. I think it's like you said, it was a rejection. I mean, it's obviously a scene of revenge, but it's also more symbolically sort of a rejection of, I think, being taken advantage of, right? And being taken advantage of Ben, who sort of represents sort of the upper caste, sort of the evils of, I guess you would say, capitalism, and or sort of modern society, and a return more to like, primalism.
Yeah, and it's not like I said, it's very implicit, but I think that theme of like prostitution, human trafficking is important because I also see it as a rejection of maybe the prostitution of Korea to the American imperialistic empire.
Yeah, it could be.
I think there's a lot in that scene. I think there's a lot like I think the general idea is the rejection of like the capitalism and the maybe the shallowness of the modern culture.
No. All right, go ahead.
But like I think also you can break it down even further and say it's a rejection. Like there's a lot in that scene. This is why I think a lot of people probably like when they talk about this movie, they will specifically talk about that ending. So.
Yeah, it was wild. Now the other thing I wanted to bring out as a possibility is throughout this movie, it's hard to decipher what is true or what is not, or what is a dream necessarily. So the other thing that sort of came to mind is like, did this really happen? Or is this sort of a dream or some of the inspiration that Jong-seo sort of wants the story to play out? Because I think at one point you do see Jong-seo writing. So it kind of got me wondering, is this sort of what he's envisioning part of his tale of Ben to be about?
Yeah, like you're right, because like the dream sequences in this movie are like it blends in perfectly. So one could argue that last scene is really a dream of his of wish fulfillment. That he wishes that's what he could do.
Or it could just be what is going to be taking place within his book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a valid idea and interpretation. But I think what's important about this movie, and I want to highlight, is that regardless of what interpretation you take from certain scenes, or like, oh, he's the murderer, I think those are, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, the plot itself is a semantics or something deeper. And I think the themes are kind of like, no matter if you think Ben did it or not, or Jaime committed suicide or not, I think the themes are still the same no matter what. And that's where I think the power of this movie is. No matter what interpretation you and I take, completely different, I think the themes are kind of like universal, and they're kind of like they don't bend no matter what we think the semantics of that story was. We can debate those forever because we'll never get true answers, but I think that's getting lost in, I think, the message.
That being said, I think the idea that he is involved in human trafficking, I think there's overwhelming evidence for that, as opposed to the idea that he killed Jaime.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we're on the same page. But like, even if you think that he's not a human trafficker, he's just some exploitative Wall Street guy.
Yeah.
It's still, I think the message can still be honed in that like what the film was trying to portray, which I give credit to the film and the director and the screenwriters. Like that's rare to pull off.
Yeah. That being said, I mean, we've touched pretty much upon pretty much every scene in this film. I thought this film was just absolutely phenomenal, from writing to directing style to the acting. This was like just a mind-blowing film to watch.
Yeah, and it's a bit controversial, maybe because of the modern take, but I actually like this movie more than Parasite, which is might be blasphemy for a lot of people. But
I am on the same page with you here.
And I liked Parasite a lot. It's one of my favorite.
I think we both did.
There's something like artistic and kind of magical about it. That's the only way I'll describe it.
About this movie, yeah, and boy, after watching this film, like I've seen a lot of what I would consider questionable awards given at the Oscars. This is one that, beyond being best, I know Parasite was one of the most recent, or was the most recent film to be awarded Best Picture. it's hard for me not to see this as being a Best Picture worthy film.
Not you mean not being right? Like
Not being, yeah, like in 2018. I'm kind of curious. Let me pull this up real quick.
well, I
But
think maybe it went under the radar. I don't remember a lot of hype in 2018 around this film.
yeah, I mean, I was not aware of this film. I'm not really that aware of Steven Yeun's career in general. But yeah, I had not heard of this film prior to when you when you sort of decided this.
I've actually read some of the critics. It seems like what the 2 points I see a lot is it's too like it's slow and long and it's not really about anything.
All right, so I'm gonna totally disagree. I just pulled up who the winner was. I saw this movie. I thought it was way too overhyped. And I am a fan of Guillermo del Toro, but I don't think The Shape of Water was better than this film.
I haven't seen that one yet. Maybe you should bring it up as a review.
I would prefer not to watch that film again.
But I've read some of the critiques of Burning, and I get it on a superficial level, but I think unfortunately it says a lot about sometimes the critics or even people in general that I think they're missing the boat a bit on this movie. I'm not going to say like every detail in this movie was perfect, but this movie is like very close to what I consider like cinema, versus just like movies,
Yeah. But I have not been blown away by a film quite like this since arguably Birdman. I think we talked about it.
Yeah, Birdman also a recommendation. Please watch that.
Yeah. If you haven't seen it. But yeah, I thought, there was very little to sort of nitpick at when it came to this film in terms of critiques, in my opinion. You could argue it was slow, but it was done intentionally. And it was done for ambiguity's sake of this film, which really worked in its favor.
Yeah, it was pun intended. The movie is like a slow burn, and like it's truly enjoyable. And I think it reminds me of here. I'll do a little analogy with Stalker, where I think our society's changed a lot. Where we kind of used to films now, and I think this is why Parasite really got acclaimed, because I think we're used to films with a little bit higher pace. I think we're seeing this a lot in a lot of cultural like pillars. So like I've noticed that this is unrelated to the movie, but thematically I'm gonna connect it. I was watching a YouTuber kind of dissect how the NBA, the amount of possessions per game have gone up every 5 years.
Skyrocketed.
Yeah, and I think we can point to a lot of examples like social media, Netflix, and I think movies is another great example where I think modern day, let's say the average viewer, they're used to a certain tempo, pace in movies, even the great ones, even the ones that win the Academy Awards. And I think movies like Burning or even like Stalker from a different era, I think they're getting lost a little bit in the shuffle because I think the room for these kind of films is getting smaller, and that's unfortunate. But I think it's indicative to I think our modern culture.
Yeah, what I will say is the pace of Parasite was very good throughout the film. It was quicker. Nothing seemed very wasted either within that movie, which is why I enjoyed it quite a bit too. I thought that for 2019, I thought that did deserve Best Picture.
No, it was a great movie, but I think what I'm getting at is that like a movie like Parasite has a better time flourishing in our modern kind of environment.
Yeah, because it was a better, quicker pace.
Burning, versus Burning, which is stylistically also it's different, and it's not something that like I think most audience, even if they're like critics, they're so used to like the good tempo and the.
Yeah, what was interesting about Parasite too, since they're both Korean directors, it was really interesting to see. You can point to sort of certain shifts within this movie, but there was a clear part 1 and part 2 in that film, which they sort of took away from intermission of typical plays.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you want to get to ratings within this movie?
I'll let you do your rating first.
I will give it, if I had a sign, it would read a 10 out of 10. This is, I think, by far the best film that I've seen since we've reviewed. That's not to take away with any of the previous films. I think, for the most part, we haven't really chosen any movies that we really dislike, aside from maybe 1 or 2 from, I guess, either of us. But yeah, this was just, this is what you call sort of like, this is true film cinematography art. from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, in general, my criteria for movies is, there's always style, there's always preference, but I think the truly good movies, not good movies, great movies, they invoke something that you can't describe. And I will say that when I watched this at the beginning, I thought, oh, looks like a good movie, it's solid. But as I kept watching it, and even after the fact, I was like, this movie, how am I still talking about this movie? Like, it's supposed to be slow and slow burning, but I was like, it's a movie that I'm never gonna forget, and it's very rare. I've seen movies that we've discussed, like, oh, should we bring it on the podcast? And I go like, I remember the movie, but I only remember like 2 scenes. Maybe I can't rewatch it. This movie, I feel like I'm going to remember forever. Like, it's one of those like films, like I will recommend and I will watch and I will and it's and I have a hard criteria. So the fact that I'm giving this score, I think the audience should know that I try not to give out 10 out of 10s. But this movie is a 10 out of 10 because I think it's a movie that represents, it's not just the film itself and the style and the acting, but also the time period and also the social issues that I think people in Canada, America, Korea, Japan, Czech Republic, Croatia, Mexico, I think people, there might be some differences in culture, but I think this era of, let's say, late capitalism is dubbed and by many academics, there's something universal with our struggle, and I don't want to get too much political stuff here, but there is something to that, common struggle of those with capital and those without. And that hasn't changed since, the 19th century. So
it hasn't changed for like the history of civilization, really.
But there are some modern differences, but I don't want to get into that right now. But I will say that
that might be your personal take, but okay.
It's definitely a bit different, just because how we measure and view the economy.
Okay.
But this movie, yeah, it's definitely one of those where I would consider it to be very, very, like, you have to, if you're like in film school, you have to at least discuss or even maybe view at least maybe clips of this movie, because even how it's like made, it's like very, very, like, it gets you. It almost works on a subliminal level too, like the film itself. So that's all. I would, like I said, it's 10 out of 10. It's one of the few movies I can genuinely say is a masterpiece level, and I think it's just, there's no words. I will say this is the greatest maybe compliment I could give a film. This podcast still doesn't give this movie justice. You have to.
You gotta watch it.
You gotta watch it. Like some movies we've discussed, I'll be honest with you. You can probably like listen to it and be like, okay, I'm not that interested in the movie, I got the gist, but this is like a movie where like our conversation, we could break it down for 2 more hours and it still wouldn't be enough. So I'll leave it at that.
I mean, yeah, I don't think there's anything else I can add to that. I hope if you stuck with us throughout the duration of this podcast, you've already seen the movie. If you haven't, highly recommend that you go watch it. But anyway, I think that's just about wraps it up for this week's episode. This is, I believe, our longest episode we've recorded. If you liked our commentary on the movie, Burning, please like and subscribe to our channel. And stay tuned for next week where we will be reviewing the movie Pi, which is sort of a cult classic 1998 movie. So, yeah, stay tuned.